All right, I think I'll make a start then. Thank you everyone for joining us today at this Mint House event. Whether you've been to one of our events before or this is the first one that you're joining us for, you're very welcome and we're really pleased that you're here. We're already doing a few introductions in the chat, so it's really great to see people here from a variety of countries. And yeah, we're really pleased that you can all be joining us today. We're really happy today to have Mercer here speaking for us today, who is the Restorative Justice and Practice Lead for the AIM project. I'll let him say a bit more about what the AIM project is, but the AIM project has been working in the field of children and adolescents with harmful sexual behaviours for over 20 years. And they're the leading UK and international organisation in this area of work, which is obviously a very niche area, but a very interesting and important area. They provide models, frameworks and practice guidance, some of which Vince I think is going to cover today, and they also provide training in these areas as well. The AIM project specialises in cases which involve children and adolescents, as I said. However, there are many aspects of their work which I believe are hugely relevant to all cases of sexual harm. So I hope that you'll find today helpful in developing your knowledge of how to understand and approach restorative justice in cases of sexual harm, whether they're with children or not, whether they're with adult cases. So yeah, we're very pleased to have Vince here. I'll pop, obviously you can see there the website address is there, but I'll also pop the website address in the chat. And then before we start, I had just a few other quick announcements and things. This event is free of charge. We would suggest that if you would like to and you're able to, we would suggest a pay-as-you-feel donation of £5, which you can give through our website if you're able to, and that just helps us to cover the cost of the event. We want this to be an accessible event, which is why it's not a paid-for event, but if you are able to contribute, we'd obviously very gratefully receive any contributions. So you can donate on our website, which I'm just putting in the chat as well, which is minthouseoxford.co.uk/donate. Also, we aren't able to keep your email addresses from when you registered because of UK data privacy regulations, which is annoying, but maybe nice for you. You won't be inundated with emails. But if you would like to receive future emails from us about upcoming events and other training opportunities, other things that we're doing at the Mint House, we would obviously love to send you that if you'd be interested to hear from us. So if you would like that, please can you email me, which is joy@minthouseoxford.co.uk, and I will add you to our list. And I will also put my email address there in the chat. And that means that then we'll have a paper trail just saying that you definitely want to receive our emails if we ever get audited on such things. The Mint House, as I said, hosts events, and we host series of events throughout the year with speakers on a variety of topics related to restorative justice and restorative practice. And we actually have a talk next week, which is on the topic of restorative approaches to the climate crisis. So if you're interested in that, you can look up the details on our website. And we've actually also just published details today of an event in November on restorative justice and spirituality. So if either of those are interesting to you, have a look on our website, and you can also sign up via Eventbrite for either of those events. And those are also both free events, as our network events are. One very final thing, and then I promise I'll let Vince speak. We would love to have your feedback after the event. So I'll leave a feedback link in the chat, but obviously you won't want to look at it until later. I'll put it again at the end of the session as well. We'd love to have your feedback so that we can improve future events and get an idea of what other things might be interesting, other topics for events and things as well. So, and we have a Google form event evaluation form there. So if you later on are happy to fill that in, and that would really help us. So that's everything from me. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Vince, and yeah, I'll let him get going. Thank you so much, Vince. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks very much. I'm constantly amazed by the power of Zoom. That we're able to connect people from Vancouver, Boulder, Colorado, Norway, and even as far afield as Swindon. I mean, it's just such a powerful tool, isn't it? Fantastic. Anyway, welcome everyone. Thanks very much. I'll just explain a little bit about what I'm going to hope to do today and the timing of it. I've shortened this presentation 3 times. You may not think that at the end of the presentation, but believe me, I have. My intention is to be quite leisurely in the way that I do the presentation, because I have a bit of a tendency to talk quicker and quicker as I get nervous. So I'm going to deliberately try to calm the nerves and be quite a bit more leisurely. And to allow a little bit of time for reflection, and self-evidently at the end of the presentation, I'll be hoping to finish within about 50 minutes, just to allow sufficient time for discussion and questions afterwards. That's often the interesting part anyway, so I won't want to condense that. And again, just before I begin, I think I'd like to say something about the significance of this event, really, in terms of 2 previous presentations that the Mint House has very kindly hosted. And probably the importance, actually, there has been a demand from people across the globe, really, from restorative practice and outside of the restorative justice world, to consider the issue of how sexual violence could be addressed or included in a restorative approach. And this is, as I say, the third of 3 presentations. The initial one was by Estelle Zinstad, who led the European Forum 2-year Daphne project, which we were participants in as well, from I think it was 2017 to 19, I'm not entirely sure, which was looking at exactly this, the application of restorative work in sexual violence, not just within Europe, but across the globe. And that has been a landmark piece of work, because to my knowledge to date, it's been the most comprehensive survey of work that's been undertaken and the most comprehensive analysis of that work. And the reason I'm sort of flagging that up is that I'm going to attempt today to link back to that, to some of the things that we've done in our journey to develop work in this field. Very much reflects what other people in other places at other times have also considered to be good practice. And that's really reassuring that you're not out there on your own, there are other people. And then the second of these presentations was a group of three staff looking at the application of restorative work with regard to adults who sexually harm. And again, there was a connection there for me, because self-evidently one of my colleagues who was responsible for the drawing up of the training programme that we deliver on adult-based work was one of the core presenters of that piece of work. And I'll refer back to this document actually as we get towards the end of the presentation, the framework that we have for working with adults. But my task for today is to talk about harmful sexual behaviour in the context of children and young people who sexually harm. And I think Joy was quite right to say it might initially present as a bit of a niche area, but in many ways it isn't a niche area, in both good and bad ways. I suppose in the bad ways is the proportion of young people who at some stage in their lives will show, display, or be a victim of some form of sexual harm is rising exponentially. We're just in the UK coming through a period of significant concern and debate and reflection upon the degree of sexual violence and sexual harassment that takes place within the schools context. And then aside that, of course, we've got the same concerns and issues in relation to further education, higher education, universities, etc., etc. And belatedly, the UK government has released guidance around school-based sexual harm. It's taken a long time to get them to do it. I won't go into the reasons why, but certainly a reluctance to recognise this as a significant problem. But the growing crescendo of concern and anxiety around this has actually forced their hand. So for the first time, we do now in the UK have quite strong policies and procedures around sexual violence, sexual harassment, and harmful sexual behaviour in a schools context. I'm not specifically going to talk about restorative practice in a schools context, because that's another topic, but it's certainly one that would be very interesting to visit sometime in the future, Joy, perhaps, if you can, obviously you have Belinda as part of your group of supporters, it may be useful to consider that around sexual violence. Generally, though, within the criminal justice world, we would estimate in England and Wales, because Scotland has a separate jurisdiction, but within England and Wales, of all sexual offences committed against children and young people, at least 1/3 are committed by other children and young people. So in that sense, it's not a niche topic either. It's a significant proportion. And as a consequence, AIM as an organisation has been working in this field, as Joy said, really since 2000. I don't want to big up AIM. You can visit the website and look at the work we do. But the restorative practice is one element of what the project is engaged upon. It's the element that I manage. I'm going to tell a little story in a moment as to how that work began. And in fact, that's going to be a bit of the motif for the entire presentation. I don't want to sit here today and tell you this is the way it should be done, or this is the best practice. I'm going to share with you what we determined from our approach was best practice in our context. Because you were a very disparate audience, very wide experience, you will probably look at some of the elements that I will be saying and talking about, think, yeah, these might apply to me in my context, but some others won't. So I'm merely offering the AIM project's journey over 2 decades as an example about how work can progress. And the project itself, the AIM project, has always been very, very generous about sharing that work with other practitioners. That's the motif of AIM. It's about skilling up practitioners, either restorative practitioners or social workers or youth offending team workers or probation officers, to be able to address harmful sexual behaviour in an effective way. So that's our focus. So that's the AIM project. One other thing I want to sort of say about working with children and adolescents, when we consider the rollout of restorative justice within England and Wales, it really did start in the juvenile estate. It's really only been over the past 5, 6, 7 years that we've started to seriously consider application of this work to adults. That's not been the case in other countries. Other countries have begun with adult-based work because they've had concerns about particular sensitivities around working with children and young people, and they've done it the reverse way. But in England and Wales, the youth justice system has always been more adventurous, is perhaps a word I would use, and certainly much more willing to adopt new practice. So it's quite often been a catalyst for developing new areas of work, which then get applied in an adult context. And that's certainly true of the restorative work. So in 2001, when we started our journey on this, the UK, or England and Wales, was probably only 2 or 3 years in to all of the implementation of the restorative work that came about from the Crime and Disorder Act in 1997. So we started this work actually very early, I think, when I look back. I'm still a little bit shocked how quick we were off the mark with this in terms of the implementation. And that's the reason why we have initially focused on the child and adolescent work. And it really has been over the past 3 or 4 years that, as I say, I've worked with colleagues in Restorative Solutions and Thames Valley Probation Service to develop an adult model, which is largely informed from the work that we did with children and adolescents. So that's an interesting sort of spin on the way that people normally see things. So, right, let's begin. I know it's a cliche, but I like journeys, either by bike, camper van or on foot, but this is a sort of complex journey that we've gone through collectively within the project. And I framed it in sort of 3 broad areas of focus. The first question, why? And that is still a legitimate question to ask now. Why would we use restorative practice or restorative approaches to harmful sexual behaviour? I'm going to spend less time on answering that, though, because I feel that the previous 2 sessions have really thoroughly explored that. And as I say in the introduction to our practice guidance, flashing at you now, the question for us very quickly moved away from why, but to how. And I think I sometimes feel a little bit frustrated when we keep getting dragged back to the why question, because for me it's self-evident, and for many other practitioners it's self-evident. The question is more about how do we do it safely and securely. Well, the reason I begin this presentation with why, because back in 2000, I'm managing what was called the Family Group Meetings Project in Greater Manchester. 2.4 million people, so in UK terms, a major conurbation. And we were dealing with a lot of serious cases committed by young people primarily, adolescents. We were dealing with burglary, aggravated burglary, arson, murder, death by dangerous driving, very serious drug-related offences, etc., etc. And we had a model of practice that was self-evidently, we were one of only 3 projects at that time in England and Wales that was using restorative practice with what were then called serious and persistent offenders. And we developed a model of practice around how that would work. But it occurred to me sort of 2 years in that we never had a sexual case. We'd never had a case of a sexual nature whatsoever. We dealt with, the same, many other very serious cases. Until one day the phone rang, and it was a colleague of mine, police officer from an authority that will remain nameless but was Oldham. And Joan, who was a police officer, great worker, great restorative worker, really a real attribute to that youth offending team, said, "Vince, I want to talk about a case, and I'd just like your call on it." And she told me this story, which we've subsequently come to call the long walk across the street, which was basically a young man who was 15, I think 14 or 15 at the time. And in many ways, this was almost a classic babysitting situation where during a babysitting period when he was left unsupervised, caring for 2 younger children, he'd sexually harmed these 2 younger children. And this had occurred in a part of Greater Manchester, which is very tightly knit, a tight working class community. For those of you who are familiar with the soap opera Coronation Street, this is what we're sort of envisaged, this tight-knit community, back-to-backs. Everybody's business is everybody's business because of the nature of that community. And some behaviours can cause significant, not just upset, but in this case, significant impact and trauma, both to the individuals, but also to the particular community. And the worker, Joan, wanted to take a restorative approach to addressing this particular offence. The young man had not gone through the court, he'd gone through a diversionary process, he accepted responsibility for what he'd done. And she wanted to be able to run what was in those days called a restorative conference. But her manager said no. To parody it, he said, RJ doesn't do sex. And I knew the manager, I had a lot of confidence in him as an individual. And initially I was a bit taken aback by the strength of his reaction, but then I sort of managed to get that internal calm place and think, well, what's behind that? What's the thinking behind that? Why did he say no? Anyway, a few weeks later, I bumped into Joan at a network meeting and she said, "Do you want to hear what happened?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love to know." And apparently she was told she couldn't do this work. It was completely off bounds. She couldn't offer a restorative approach. But she subsequently found out that the 2 mothers of the 2 victims had walked across the street, and that's the long walk across the street, and knocked on the door of the house of the offender. We'll use that language, the offender and the offender's mother. And when the door opened, very little and quite tentatively, in a fearful way, the 2 mothers basically said, "I think we need to talk. We need to talk about what's happened and the impact it's had on us and our children. And we need to make sure this doesn't ever happen again." And that for me was a really powerful message to get back from Joan, which was, although the manager, for reasons that I can understand, basically said, "No way, Jose, we don't go there, we're not doing it." In fact, the need for those people at the centre of that harm was so great that they'd been motivated themselves to sit down together and hold some form of conversation. Not a facilitated conversation, not necessarily even a restorative conversation. We don't know the nature of that conversation. But in a way, that's less important. What is important here is that they needed it. They needed to address the harm. And Joan, together with me, felt that as professionals, we'd almost abandoned them. We'd failed to deliver, because we know we can facilitate those conversations very effectively and very sensitively, but we'd been forbidden, or she'd been forgiven from doing that. So very quickly, the question didn't become why and why not, but how, and how would we do that safely? And within 6 months, I ended up then working alongside colleagues in this project called AIM. For the past 21 years, that's been the question that every day almost we've thought about. How do we provide practice which is safe, appropriate, and accountable? And how do we develop that? And then when we feel we've developed that, how do we disseminate that knowledge to other restorative practitioners? Because you know what, if this has happened in Manchester, it could easily be happening in Hamburg, it could be happening in Paris, it could be happening in New York, it could be happening in Bergen, it could be happening in Milan, because this was a pressure that was driven by people at the centre of harm, and that level of sexual harm probably exists, almost certainly exists in many, many countries. So our starting point really was to jump from the why to the how. And I'm by nature quite a cautious person. People who know me might tell you different, but I think I am. So I'm really careful about how we develop practice. I was comfortable in what we were doing with some serious cases. I'd been trained in serious case mediation in the States, and I had a project that was, I felt, strong in its practice values. But working in a sexual field was taking me into an area that I felt apprehensive about. So my starting point really was to begin to say, I need to know more about the nature of what was then not called harmful sexual behaviour. It was then called sexual violence in the youth justice context, I think. I needed to know something about the nature of the offence and the harm, something about the victim characteristics. I felt I needed to know something about the needs of those people and how a restorative process could be adapted and amended to meet those needs. And we began by looking at local research within Greater Manchester, because it's a big authority, it generates a lot of work. Unfortunately, within the organisation I was working for, it had a research arm, and they were very happy to help. And they conducted a piece of research which looked at a sample of 107 cases, I think it was in total, of harmful sexual behaviour across Greater Manchester for a period of time. And they started to build a profile about the nature of that harm, the characteristics of those who'd shown the harm and those who'd been harmed, and something about the nature of their needs and responses. So that was useful, but I felt that we needed to also have a bit more of a broader perspective and an international perspective of that as well. So we ultimately began to work with, as I say, the Daphne EU funded project a few years later, about a decade later, which for me was incredibly exciting because it turned out that lots of people in lots of diverse countries were, to be blunt, on the same pathways, the same journeys. They were considering how do they do this work safely and appropriately. And many of them were developing the same strategies and the same policies and procedures and the same practices that we developed. That has to be reassuring. It means that we're on the right direction in that sense. And then when we felt that we knew enough about the nature of the behaviour, we established a small demonstration caseload to be able to test out how a restorative approach could be delivered safely and appropriately. And we did that for quite a number of years in different settings, in a community setting and in a custodial setting, always working with young people who were sexually harmed, who were adolescents. The victims of those young people were sometimes, most often, other adolescents or children, but were occasionally adults as well. And in fact, one of the cases that we initially got not saying notoriety for or fame for, but was brought very much to a broader audience, was a case of an adult victim, a teacher who'd been raped by a pupil. And that particular individual, I can name her because she I won't say happy, but agreed to release her anonymity. Jo Nodding presented all across England and Wales and was very, very vocal. In fact, worked with the Restorative Justice Council to campaign for victims' rights to be entitled to be considered for restorative work, restorative approaches in sexual cases. So we considered, how do we take the learning from that? How do we show that what we'd done well and what we felt we could do better, because there were some things that we did that I would probably go back and redo in a completely different way. And the way that AIM works as an organisation is it develops practice tools and guidance that it then trains frontline staff in. So being part of AIM, that was the model we took. We started to write practice guidance. And in fact, the most recent one, this one here, which is 2021, according to how you count the previous editions, by my estimation, is about the 5th edition of practice guidance over the years that we've released. And by far and away, the most comprehensive one, I have to say. And we, as Joy said before, we developed training modules, and the training modules are very much about delivery of the practice guidance to restorative practitioners who are asking the same questions that we asked back in 2001. Initially, why, but then how? And that's pretty much what the presentation today is going to cover, really, is say something about that practice guidance and something about the AIM approach. I'm going to take a slurp of water. I'm not monitoring, Joy's doing this for me, I'm not monitoring the chat box. Is there anything that I need to address, Joy, from the chat box? Or?
Not yet, but if the participants do want to chip in at any time with a question in the chat, then I'll save those until the end and then we have a question time. Or if you are happy to, you could ask a question yourself in the question time if you're happy to talk. Yeah. Or appear on screen as well later. So, and if
it's urgent, flag it up straight away and I'll try to address it.
But there's nothing yet. Thanks.
Okay. Right, excellent. So the AIM Restorative Practice and Harmful Sexual Behaviour Assessment. Now, in that little sentence, there were some really important words that I just want to flesh out a little bit. We talked about AIM. What's this thing called restorative practice? And why am I not saying restorative justice? Well, for the first years of our work, all of our work took place within a criminal justice context. And I felt quite happy and contented to use the phrase restorative justice. I still do now. But one of the things over the past couple of years that really has become apparent is to try and develop the work that takes place outside of the criminal justice context. And it will not surprise you that when we talk about sexual offending or sexual harm, the vast majority of that harm is not criminalised. And that's for a number of reasons. And the most obvious one is the sheer incapacity and inability of the criminal justice system to meet the needs of people who have been sexually harmed. And many cases do not get prosecuted because people don't report it because they've got little faith in the competence of the criminal justice system, not individual agencies as such, but the criminal justice system in its totality. So an awful lot of harmful sexual behaviour is either not reported, or if it's reported, is ignored or parked to one side as being, quotes, difficult. And so we felt that we needed to develop a restorative approach which wasn't just located within the criminal justice context, but could be adapted and amended for cases that don't go down the criminal justice route. Otherwise, we're only dealing, restoratively at least, potentially with a small tip of the iceberg, the stuff that actually gets to court or goes down the diversionary process. And what do we know in the UK, England and Wales, although I think it's the same in Scotland, is the numbers of cases that are actually prosecuted and reach anything like a successful conclusion during the criminal justice route has collapsed over the past 10, 15 years. I don't know what the current figures are now. I'd be guessing in terms of serious sexual offences from report to conviction, probably somewhere in the region of 3 to 4%, and maybe even lower than that. Some of you guys may know more appropriate figures. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to adopt the phrase restorative practice was to recognise the fact that we're not just working within the criminal justice system. we can work in a bigger system, a much, much broader system. And I quite like the phrase restorative practice because it felt to me more inclusive. I'm not saying restorative justice isn't inclusive, self-evidently is, but for our practice, it seemed important to be linking in to those cases that don't go down that route. And here's this phrase, HSB, harmful sexual behaviour. What an odd phrase this is. I did actually start working with young people sexually harmed back in the 80s. Wow, can you remember the 80s? Big hair, big shirts, big music, fantastic. Not necessarily very big ideas, I have to say, because all we did when we worked with young people sexually harmed in the 80s is we just borrowed adult-based models. We looked at what happened with adult sex offenders, and we did that with what we called juvenile sex offenders. And I can look back on some of that practice and think, oh my God, what were we doing? But we didn't know any better. Over the decades, one of the great things about working in harmful sexual behaviour is it's very well informed by research and best practice within the field. It's a really exciting field to work in as a social worker or as a probation officer, because there's a very close link between practice and research, which isn't true of lots of other areas, I'm afraid to say, of criminal justice. And over the years, one of the things that became interesting was the field started to adopt this phrase, initially sexually harmful behaviour, and then for reasons that are a bit complex, slightly reversing that and going to harmful sexual behaviour. And to this day, part of my job has been training social workers and probation officers in harmful sexual behaviour assessments on offenders. And I always begin by saying, think about the words we use to describe the behaviours or what we're addressing, because the words are important. They're important because of labelling and the impact upon the people we're working with, but they also say an awful lot about our values and our approaches. And I absolutely embrace the term harmful sexual behaviour because it begins with a concept of harm. Now, that is just amazing, that there's a description of a behaviour which is massively impactful and sometimes incredibly traumatic. Not always, but sometimes is. But they begin with the phrase harm. But we don't describe burglary as harmful property behaviour or car crime as vehicular harmful behaviour. But we do in the UK, at least, and beyond that in other contexts and other cultures, start to talk about harmful sexual behaviour. And then the second word, sexual. So it tells us this is about an act which is intimate and sensitive and sexual in nature. So there is an issue there about sensitivity and appropriateness and how we handle that. And that's important to consider as well. And then the last word, B, behaviour. So this is a behaviour which can be changed and challenged. And in fact, one of the positive things for me about working in this field is that young people who sexually harm, the vast majority of them will not go on to become adults who sexually harm. So the recidivism rate, if we want to get technical, is actually quite low. But this is a group of young people who respond incredibly well to interventions. So we can divert young people from pathways which are harmful onto positive, healthy, and safe sexual development. And that is a very, very important mission, I think, within the field, not to create more victims. And certainly when I'm thinking about schools-based work, what a fantastic opportunity that is to be able to produce a generation of young people who are much more aware of their own sexual development, their sexual needs, and the interests and concerns of others. And if we can do that, then we're going to change a lot of things in the adult world 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So restorative practice and HSB, in a sense, are sort of simple phrases, but they actually sum up an awful lot more than that. So the third edition covers the things that are linked there, underlying principles and theory. I'm going to very quickly talk a little bit about that, but not to get too bogged in that. The research background I'm going to talk a little bit about, but to be honest, Estelle covered this very well in her first presentation. So if you have an opportunity to go back and look at that or look at the work that they produced, the documentation, that is, as I say, today, the most rich narrative of research around this field. So the AIM project approach, I'm going to introduce that to you and talk about what the AIM approach is, talk a little bit about key elements of that, which are basically to be adopting trauma-aware restorative practice, to be looking at issues around interfamilial work, which is a core characteristic of child and adolescent harmful sexual behaviour. And at the heart of our approach is formalised assessment. So this is the AIM approach. It's taken 2 decades for me to get to a point where I feel like I can sort of say, yes, we have an approach and we can call it the AIM approach. I mean, I've resisted that for years. Like, I don't know, do we know enough? Are we sure? You know, I'm not sure now. I think I have a healthy area, a degree of uncertainty, but I think I can say there is a characteristic AIM approach, and that consists of 7 core areas, really. The first is that it's led by a very structured and comprehensive assessment. I'll talk a bit more about that as we get going, because that's an important part of what we do. The assessment isn't just about giving the green light to do the work, oh yes it's safe, or no it's not safe. It's about informing how we do the work. So it's about identifying the risks and needs of participants, and that in turn assists us in how we gather the accounts and narratives of people. And one of the areas that we're also interested in is work that's grounded in theory. One of the theories that we use in our work is narrative-based approaches, sort of a narrative theoretical perspective. And that shapes the work we do, the restorative methodology, the tools we employ, and how we deliver it. And in the doing of that, it makes us very conscious of the trauma that has been experienced by the people we're working with, and not just the trauma in relation to the offence or the harm, but the trauma that many of them will have suffered beforehand anyway. So I know, for instance, that many victims of harmful sexual behaviour will be traumatised by the what happened, the harm itself, but they're equally also quite often secondary traumatisations about how the system responds to them or fails to respond to them. And there are even traumatic responses in connection to the shame that victims feel around harmful sexual behaviour. And that's something that strikes people as odd. Why should victims of harmful sexual behaviour experience shame? But they do. And so when we talk about shame within the field of harmful sexual behaviour, we're not just looking at the shame of the offender, we're thinking about the response of those who've been harmed as well. But we're also thinking about possible traumatic experiences even prior to the harm occurring. So, for instance, young people who sexually harm, typical of many young people caught up in, say, the criminal justice system, they will have had what we call adverse childhood, not just also widely called adverse childhood experiences, which have been wholly negative in terms of their development. They may have been sexually abused themselves, or physically or emotionally abused, witness experienced domestic violence. So all of that developmental history of traumatic experience does speak to and inform both what they've done subsequently, but how they respond to that. And I know I've worked with young people who are traumatized by their own behaviors, who have done things that they've had absolutely no understanding of the consequences of, and then have been massively traumatically impacted by the recognition of the harm they've caused. So a trauma-informed approach isn't just about the nature of the offence, if you like, or the harm, it's about all the other stuff as well. And that should also be informed by practice experience and practitioner standards, so that we should be doing work which, in the UK at least, is not just consistent with, but informs and develops the practice standards that the Restorative Justice Council has developed, the current one's been 2020. So we have work which is at a high level and judged against practice standards. It's accountable, because it strikes me that if we talk about work that's sensitive and appropriate, we need to be accountable to make sure that that sensitivity and appropriateness is maintained. So I'm not saying that these things are unique to the AIM approach, but they are characteristics of what we've developed in terms of our response to harmful sexual behaviour with adolescents. The underpinning theoretical frameworks, you'll be glad to know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but very quickly, they're listed there. We're looking at restorative integration theory. We're going back to Braithwaite and the sort of core theoretical perspectives around reintegrative shaming. And if we're talking about reintegrative shaming, we need to be thinking about shame management and the relationship, particularly that has with denial. And that denial might be located in the offender who minimalizes or neutralizes. It might be located in the offender's family or people around them. It might even be located around people around the victim who find it difficult to believe that this has happened to their child or their sibling. And so denial can have massive impact on victims, not just from an offender perspective. We're looking, as I said before, around an approach which is very much around how we establish our identities, the stories we tell about ourselves and the stories we hear about ourselves, and the narrative that underpins that work, how we define ourselves through those stories. I mean, human beings are storytelling and story listening creatures. And we define ourselves in stories. We define ourselves in not just what we think about ourselves, but what we tell other people about ourselves. And we're talking about young people here who are establishing identities and establishing narratives. And one of my interests is to try and establish stories for them that are positive and future focused and not held back by something that they've done that they now subsequently recognize to be so wrong and so harmful, but that labels them and their development is as a consequence massively handicapped. I want to develop work that doesn't just address trauma, but also self-evidently related to that, thinks about recovery. And from victims, self-evidently, what would be the point of doing restorative work if it wasn't helpful in the victim in starting to lose that prison of victimhood? And that's a real issue in harmful sexual behaviour generally, because other contexts would talk about victim survivors or survivors. And in that little, those two combinations of those two powerful words, there's a powerful story. I was a victim, I'm now a survivor. What's the difference between those two places? How do we enable, how do we even measure recovery? How do we get a sense of assistance to a pathway of recovery, which a victim, to be honest, may already be on, but we can accelerate through restorative work? And then the principles that we adhere to are listed there. They come from the Restorative Justice Council's most recent practice guidance, and I wouldn't argue with any of them. Self-evidently, the issue about impartiality, neutrality, but that also presents real challenges to us because we're often dealing in a situation of power imbalance. How do we maintain as practitioners neutrality and a sort of non-judgmental perspective without becoming complicit with power imbalances, which ultimately may be informing the harm that's occurred and maybe informing any future harm that occurred? So that's one of the challenges we have in harmful sexual behaviour. I tried not to use the word impartiality or neutrality. I talk about what other people have talked about, multiple partialities. But it's more complex than just being neutral or impartial. And self-evidently, I don't want to go through all of these, but the critical one there for me is about offering practices which is safe for all participants. And that was really what was at the heart of that manager saying, RJ doesn't do sex, because his concern was about you can't reach safe practice. Well, I like to think us and many other restorative practitioners have demonstrated, yes, you can. If you adhere to good practice principles and you're thoughtful about what you do, yes, you can. I'm not going to talk much about this. It's up there, the reintegrative shaming theory, Braithwaite's crime, shame and reintegration, and particularly his work around stigmatic versus reintegrative shaming has really been crucial to my thinking. Nathanson's work in 1992, looking at the disabling effects that shame has on offenders, but you could equally, as I say, expand that to look at victims and families. But really, that's a significant issue for us, because I'll talk a bit more about shame management in a moment, but if there is ever a behaviour which carries an absolute, usually carries an absolute cloak of shame, it's sexual offending. And if it doesn't, what does that tell us? So very often, to be rather crude about it, the offenders who I've been most concerned about, those who have not been ashamed about what they've done. So my starting position is a presumption of shame. And when that isn't present or it isn't somehow articulated, I'm interested to know why, because they are often the more challenging ones. Show me a process which is better at articulating and reflecting upon shame than a restorative process. Show me, and I'd adopt that. And that for AIM was one of the big buy-ins as to why they wanted to look at restorative work. This was a project that was coming very much in the direction of offender and offender management. But the managers said, we need to be bigger than that. We need to step out of our silo and think about the person that's been harmed. And we need to think about this thing called shame and what impact it has on both the victim and the offender and the families. Identity and narrative we've talked about, and I've put a Winslade and Monk, who were two incredibly influential restorative practitioners out of New Zealand, and then Howard Zeyer from the States, who have influenced our practice. So there we are, the importance of shame management. Alan Jenkins, again, a practitioner from the Antipodes, I don't know if that's the right word, from Australia, who's done a lot of work in gendered violence, both domestic violence and sexual violence. Very recognised back in 1998 and wrote an awful lot very sensitively about this. One of the biggest factors for inhibiting young people's engagement in the work they do in harmful sexual behaviour is the intense sense of shame that they often feel. And so there needs to be some way of articulating that and addressing that, not just suppressing it or sidelining it. And as it says there, that shame is also true not just of the offender, but the impact of worth from a victim or in others' eyes, the notion of sort of being despoiled or denigrated. Ruth Mann, who sadly we lost last year, has been a really powerful thinker in terms of British criminology. Really looked at one of the issues around how people's empathic responses are suppressed and what are the factors around that. And there are 5 or 6 factors that she identified. One of the core ones was where an offender feels a high level of shame about what they've done. That then feeds into this suppression of an empathic response. And that's important because if we're doing restorative work, empathy is one of the channels, self-evidently, that we're hoping to both develop and tap into. And it's important to know that for some young people who are sexually harmed, they will not present as being empathic necessarily. That doesn't necessarily mean they're not empathic, but part of the way that they will handle that shame is by diminishing the impact upon the person who they've hurt, or marginalising them, portraying them as being worthy of the harm. So that's a really important factor from offender management. Most of the young people we work with, I can't give you a very accurate figure, but I'm going to pluck it off out the ether. I'd say about 80% of our cases were interfamilial harmful sexual behaviour. And that's a core characteristic of adolescent harmful sexual behaviour. Less than 5% of adolescents who sexually harm will sexually harm a stranger. Therefore, 95%, there will be some form of relational context. And again, what is restorative practice or restorative justice if it isn't effective in addressing the relational damage and the relational impacts of harm? And so for me, it didn't surprise me, but what surprised me is the degree to which the type of cases that we got coming through were interfamilial, about 80% of them. And we developed a little bit of an area of practice expertise around that, and we developed a model of restorative work which could engage with families, which I'll briefly talk about in a moment. But there's a nice quote here, well, a nice quote, there's a powerful quote here from Duane and others, 2002. The references for these you can get through the AIM practice guidance. Parental disbelief or minimalisation should be viewed as a defence mechanism, and one that protects them from the personal implications or family implications of acceptance of their child's actions. There's a very nice piece of research being done on parents and carers of young people who are sexually harmed, looking at their responses. And a significant number of parents will deny and minimalise what their child has done. And the reasons for that are complex, but one powerful reason for many of them is the shame associated with it and the personal and negative implications of being the father of a 15-year-old who has sexually abused his 6-year-old cousin. You know, I've worked with many young men in Manchester in my past who would quite happily pull on a T-shirt that said, Manchester's best burglar, and they might even perversely feel quite proud of that. I have never worked with a young man who would pull on a t-shirt that would say Manchester's best child abuser and feel proud about that. So denial and defense and shame can't be three sides of the same coin, but they are all related to each other if we can have this triple-sided coin. Sibling harmful sexual behaviour. This is talking about half siblings and full siblings. There's an area that has really come to the fore in the HSB world over the past 4 or 5 years. It has to be sort of said that previous to this, whilst people were very aware of interfamilial harmful sexual behaviour, they were not so aware of the prevalence of sibling harmful sexual behaviour. If you are a child in a family in England and Wales and you are going to be sexually harmed by somebody within your family, by far most likely is you will be sexually harmed by a sibling. And Ballantyne 2012, again, the references in the guidance, reflected on quite a lot of evidence that it's estimated to be 5 times more prevalent than parent-on-child harmful sexual behaviour. That's an incredible figure. Because when we tend to think of children who are sexually harmed, we tend to think of adults, the dodgy uncle or the creepy grandfather or the really, really creepy father. And they are all, legitimate characters to think about. But the sibling? Yes, the sibling. And in fact, on the Channel 4, the television series in the UK, there was an interesting documentary 2 years back called Family Secrets, which was looking at a restorative approach to a harmful sexual behaviour. The main people within this documentary were now adults, but the sexual harmful behaviour occurred when the victim was as young as 9, I think, and her brother was 4 or 5 years older. And that was a sibling case. It's also the least likely to be reported, and interestingly enough, the least likely to go down the criminal justice route. So that really concurs with our concerns before about the restorative practice, looking at cases outside of the monolith that is the criminal justice system. Issues around disclosure for the abused siblings are particularly problematic because the case study we use in our training is a sibling HSB. For the victim in that situation to disclose what happened to her, she was very aware of what the consequences were going to likely to be in terms of the explosion she was about to set off within her family. And their concerns primarily, not unlike other victims of harmful sexual behaviour, is are they likely to be believed or are they likely to be blamed? But more than any other area of harmful sexual behaviour, they are really acute dilemmas, because am I likely to be believed by my mum is a really powerful question to ask. If my mum doesn't believe me, what does that do for that child, that young person? These are very, very powerful responses which can be incredibly impactful and traumatic. I'm not going to say as much as the offence or the harm, but sometimes on an equivalence with that. And yet we know from, I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this properly, Stahopoulos. If there's anybody here from the Greek area of Europe, they will be holding their heads in disbelief at that pronunciation, but nonetheless, that's an attempt. Noted that actually the victim's recovery is very much influenced by the degree to which they will be believed and supported. Now, we know that from other victims, being believed and supported is a core factor in their recovery, but it's especially so in terms of interfamilial harmful sexual behaviour. And quite often our restorative work has been very much focused not just upon the impact of the harm, but the response of the family after the harm has been disclosed. And we also then need to think a bit about, obviously, denial and disbelief, I've talked about that before, but also siblings who have not been harmed, but are also impacted and affected. In the case study, we talked about one of the siblings who hasn't been harmed and affected. Well, she has been harmed and affected, but not sexually harmed. And these are often referred to as the forgotten or the hidden siblings. Restorative assessment, why is that so important? I want to come back to that. Well, it's important in our practice because of the Victims Code of Practice, which talks about entitlement to be considered for restorative processes where it's safe and applicable. In other words, the Victims Code of Practice brings in the idea of suitability. That's a massive challenge for restorative practice because most restorative practice is inclusive and wants to work on the principles that everybody is entitled to. And it should be driven by the needs of the participants. And if a victim demands or requires or requests this, they should have this delivered onto them. And that, in one sense, you could almost see restorative practitioners in a spectrum, those who adhere to that complete notion of total eligibility and total open access. And then at the other end of the spectrum, those who think, yeah, but for some, this is possibly not helpful, and in some instances, this is potentially harmful. Therefore, we need to consider issues around suitability. Now, that's a really sort of simple and crass sort of continuum, but I think a lot of restorative practitioners do struggle with the notion of assessment because it's a professional activity and a professional exercise of power that can sometimes disqualify people from access to services. And that runs very contrary to the basic principles of restorative work. But I don't know any other way that we can determine appropriateness and safety if we don't have an assessment framework. Unfortunately, my magic wands, the batteries run out. I can't do safe practice unless I know what the sensitivities and the trigger points are, and that requires an assessment. When we look at suitability, we're looking at issues around re-victimization, the timing for both the victim and offender, whether the offender has undertaken any form of intervention. I was watching yesterday, just as a refresher for this, the Project Restore in New Zealand, which has been quite influential on our practice, works with adults primarily. At one stage, I'm not sure it's the case now, but they absolutely required, and in fact, Estelle's research in many projects required the offender to have undergone some form of intervention before they could access a restorative approach to harmful sexual behaviour. That's not an unusual position for projects to take. Where is the victim in terms of any recovery process or pathway, and what are the particular vulnerabilities that the victim might have by virtue of age, by virtue of other vulnerabilities, special educational needs? There's a disproportionate number of young people with special educational needs in the victim population. That shouldn't surprise you. It's because of those vulnerabilities that some people will target them for harmful sexual behaviour. So we're dealing with victims which have vulnerabilities above and beyond, quite often, how can I phrase this? The core population, if that's the language you want to use. We also need to do an assessment because the RJC practice guidance requires us to do it. It requires an enhanced risk and safety assessment for sensitive and complex cases. All sexual cases in our jurisdiction or in our context are defined as sensitive and complex. So I think it's possibly the worst reason for doing assessment is because we have to, but we have to because there are very positive reasons for doing an assessment. And I'm very much in the camp of we do assessments and we should be accountable to them. I'm also from the account that when we're doing assessments, we're not necessarily assessing individuals. I feel really uncomfortable with victims to say we're doing an assessment of a victim. No, we're not. We're doing an assessment as to whether this is a process which is safe for that victim or appropriate. In a sense, we're assessing the process, not the individual. I'm not going to make judgments about whether this is a good victim or a bad victim in terms of their propensity for restorative approaches. That's not my concern. My concern is this a process which offers safety, but also some potential benefit to them? And so we're almost assessing the process rather than individuals. So I've already covered this. I don't really need to run through this. Other than one or two things there, the middle thing, it informs preparation. I said it earlier, our assessment frameworks are not traffic lights. They don't give you the green light to go. It's a dynamic process, it's a living document, and it informs how we do the preparation and how we shape the meeting. So it's not a risk assessment. I hate that phrase. It's a risk and needs-led approach. Not just a risk-led approach. In terms of practice, how we do the work, I'm going to very quickly condense this. We were very much, well, we weren't informed by Roslin's work because this came out quite late in our work, but we were reassured by what Meredith Roslin had written in her book. Flipping heck, I can't remember the title of her book. Just Emotions, that's it, just occurred to me. There's an interesting one, Just Emotions, that's the title. And Roslin was looking at what constitutes a successful interaction ritual, and she talked about 4 factors that contribute to that successful engagement, whatever the restorative methodology is you employ. Shared focus through conversational rhythm, that there's a dialogue that settles in turn taking with a common focus and communication between participants, that we as facilitators attempt to reach some conversational power balance that means that people feel empowered to contribute and not marginalised, that we provide spaces for marginalised voices. And that's a critical thing in gendered violence, because the victim self-evidently often has a marginalised voice. And this is an opportunity not to replicate that power imbalance, but to address it. That there's opportunity for a turning point, the magic moments that people used to talk about in restorative work, where the strong expression and experience of the emotion within the conference or the mediation, whatever it is model you use, becomes a point for identifying commonality and common focus. And that then leads them into a positive rhythm and flow around the interaction. And ultimately, we hope, leads to a sense of solidarity and cohesion. That doesn't always occur, but it is often incredibly important in harmful sexual behaviour in a familial context. It's about re-establishing some sense of self-evident safety, but also cohesion and resilience and power and positivity from a family perspective. Now, I think we all know, if we're experienced restorative practitioners, we don't always achieve all of those 4 elements, but when we do, that's the magic. I think that's what magic's probably the ordinary magic is a good phrase to use. That's the ordinary magic of restorative work. So Roslin's work didn't inform what we did, but she very much validated our approach towards narrative and our structuring of meetings. The models that we used, I was trained back in the 90s and subsequent to that in victim offender mediation, which in the UK means something different than it necessarily does in the States or in Canada. I guess the nearest equivalent is victim offender dialogue in an American context for colleagues over in America and North America and Canada. Mark Umbright was quite instrumental in training my approach in terms of mediation. The emphasis there is upon dialogue and about account giving and account gathering, looking at people's positions, interests and needs, which is a mediation technique that informs our work, where the facilitator's role is often minimal, or is that just to facilitate? It's not controlling or directing. Some people have concerns about mediation because of particular perspective on mediation and its applicability to harmful sexual behaviour around power and control management. I don't necessarily share those concerns because we have a particular model of victim offender mediation. Restorative conferencing, which was the primary model when Joan rang me up to ask about the long walk across the street, based upon New Zealand work that was then taken by Terry O'Neill to Australia and developed into the restorative youth conferencing model, which is probably the primary model in North America and Canada, not the primary model in Europe. When Estelle did her research, it was very interesting to see there was roughly a 50-50 split between mediation and restorative conferencing. Many European jurisdictions, Belgium has fantastic practice in this field, both in Flanders and the Flemish speaking part, and they use a mediation model. But restorative conferencing, very, how dare I say, Anglo-Saxon in its approach, although still used in Europe. And then the thing that I would strongly recommend for the work we did, which is family group conferencing, because we were working with families into familial harmful sexual behaviour. We needed a model, a restorative model that engaged well with families and had specific roles for professionals and didn't let professionals dominate the process. And family group meetings or family group conferencing is fantastic at that approach, and also working with young victims. And people say the youngest victim we worked with was a 6-year-old. That provides all sorts of challenges. Family group conferencing is a fantastic way of providing spaces for marginalised voices for young children. And unfortunately in the UK, we do very little restorative family group conferencing nowadays. If I had a magic wand or my batteries were working, I'd change that. But that's what we mainly did, basically, victim offender mediation and family group conferencing. I'm 5 minutes over, but quickly, contentious practice issues. I've already touched upon it really about the family group conferencing thing, working with other professionals. A key characteristic of harmful sexual behaviour is the broader professional context in which we have to work, particularly if you're working in child and adolescent harmful sexual behaviour, because it's all the child protection, safeguarding, wraparound cloud, both around the victim, but also around the person who's displayed the harm. And I'm sure I'm not the only person at this gathering today who have had both good and bad experiences of working with other professionals. It's a bit of a caricature to talk about silo practice, but it still exists. You know, I've worked with offender managers who say, I can't think about the victim. I can only think about what he's done and how we actually stop him doing it. Don't complicate my life with what the impact was on the offender. I've worked with victim supporters who say, I have to focus on the victim. I can't spare any time or energy thinking about the offender and the family. And both of those positions are silo positions, and they're completely untenable and do not lend themselves to restorative approaches. Most of the significant challenges to our restorative work has not come from the participants, from the offenders, the victims, or those who've been harmed, or those who are harmed. They've come from cynical, disinterested, obstructive, sabotaging professionals, or professionals who are so anxious around harmful sexual behaviour that they are overly controlling. There's a strong professional voice of domination in the field of harmful sexual behaviour. Why? Because all those who sexually harm are manipulative and devious. No, they're not, but that's a common myth. Why? Because victims are particularly traumatized and we need to protect them. And for many, that means rescue them, victim rescuing rather than enabling. So I'm going a bit overboard on this, but it's a really important thing is that we need to think about our relationships, about our restorative practice, not sitting in a bubble, but the relationships with other professionals and building positive relationships. One of the things that we've thought about in AIM over the past few years very much is the relationship of restorative practice with therapeutic provision. How does that fit into a victim recovery program or a victim support program? How does that fit into an intervention program with the person who's harmed to enable them to desist, to prevent them from progressing to become a more serious or a more prolific offender? There are massive issues around apology and whether that's appropriate and how it's given in gendered violence in general, but particularly in sexual violence. And if you think about a common pattern, it's not always, but a common pattern in gendered violence is the harm is perpetuated by apologies being made. You know, that pattern that I'm really sorry, it won't happen. I don't know what I did, I won't do this again, and then a repeat of the behavior. So apologies can have a significant role in terms of potential re-victimization, if you like, of victims. So we need to be very careful about how issues of apology and forgiveness are handled in harmful sexual behavior. If we had another 3 days, we could talk about that. But there is a really important question about, are apologies required and how are they offered and what do they mean? What, therefore, amendments do we need to make to our restorative approaches? How do we need to modify that? Which models of restorative practice are perhaps less appropriate than others? And I'm not going to express an opinion on that. You may have your own. I've already talked about cases outside the criminal justice system or pre-sentence. One of the things that I think we didn't do well, I really wished I could go back and do this completely differently. We did not establish a proper victim-led referral pathway. God knows we tried, but we got no support from the particular victim support agency that we chose to align ourselves with to enable a victim-led referral pathway. I think that's a really important characteristic of any restorative practice, that it isn't just open to referrals from the offender or the harmer pathway, but from the victim. Time issues I've not talked about, but self-evidently are important. Another area that we tried to work in was young people in custody. Again, another 3 days. I'll tell you all about that story. It was quite problematic. Engaging with young victims I've touched upon. One of the other areas that I think is particularly problematic is now the large numbers of cases of historical child sexual abuse are coming through, of victims who are perhaps in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and even older, who are reflecting back on their sexual victimization 20, 30 years ago, and are wanting to hold somebody to account because they felt that account hasn't been active over the past 2 or 3 decades. These are very difficult cases to take on for a number of reasons, not the least being because they are historical. So the evidence base, for instance, around the offender and the risks they may present or what work has been done with them is really quite often very dated and insufficient. Talked a little bit about professional position. I don't want to go on more about that. So if what I've said has not bored you silly and you've fallen asleep and planning your holidays, as we're all hoping to do now, you would like to know more, we are doing a 2-day practitioner training online. I'm not saying it's going to be the last online one, but I hope to God it is. I hope we're going to go back to face-to-face soon. But currently it's online on the 1st and 2nd of December via Zoom. The reason that's important is for colleagues who live far and beyond. This is an opportunity for them to participate. So you can look at nominations or applications, it should really say, via that incredibly short link, that snappy link that you have there. I think, Joy, we also have some flyers that can be sent out. The cost is an incredibly minimal, 372 of the Queen's pounds to participate in that course, which includes a copy of the assessment. Well, why would it not? It includes a copy of the assessment guidance and assessment framework. It's aimed at restorative practitioners, who are most of you guys out there. But you know what? We're not prejudicial. We'll work with academics. We'll work with whoever wants to come. But it is aimed at practitioners. Right, that wasn't a very good adherence to the timing schedule there, I have to say. 10 minutes over, but I'm exhausted. You must be exhausted.
Thank you so much, Vince. That's really great. We do still have a little bit of time for questions, so don't worry, we do still have some time.
Right.
We have had some questions in the chat. The first question, I won't use her name just for abundance of anonymity for the recording, but she says she's currently working with a young person who's seeking out several vulnerable females. This young person is also threatening rape and harm. The police are aware and feel they cannot support as he's a child in care and a child. And she would value any advice of where she could get support for this young person. What would you suggest?
I would go to I presume this is the UK, I would go to the local authority, the safeguarding local authority that is responsible for him. I think it is a him. And I would also have a conversation with the youth offending team, who don't just work with the young people who have gone through the criminal justice system. If there is sufficient concern about what he is suggesting he will do, not necessarily what he's done, or maybe what he's done in the past, they should be doing what's called an AIM-3 assessment. And that can either be done by social workers or it can be done by youth offending team workers. It's not a restorative assessment, but it looks at the factors that are leading to that young person's concerns around that young person's sexual behaviours. And that then generates a range of interventions. It's a wake-up call for local authorities, social services departments, child protection agencies and youth offending teams to start to work with this young person rather than to wait until he actually does something. Because self-evidently, if he's talking about it, he's flagging it. That in itself is a concern. And what we know about harmful sexual behaviour is they can very quickly accelerate from a concern to an actual event. So I would look towards the local authority and the youth offending team and say, I've got grave concerns about what this young man's saying or doing or suggesting. There needs to be a proportionate and appropriate response. And that should be assessment led. Great,
thank you, Vince. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Melanie also asked, she's interested to hear thoughts about how best to manage victim contact in offender-led requests. for restorative justice in sexual harm cases, specifically if you are already aware that the victim is still very traumatized?
Yeah, well, I don't know what I can say other than in platitudes here about with great sensitivity. Because we came from, as I say, our origins of victim offender-led pathways, this was an area that we sort of had to embrace and adopt our practice to straight away. So I think there are questions to be asked about where is the victim in terms of sufficient or adequate support, and even some form of assessment from themselves or estimation from themselves about where they are in terms of the trauma of the offence and possible pathways to recovery. We're all familiar with recovery frameworks. They're all slightly different, but they will all talk about a period of the disbelief and the period immediately following a harmful sexual behaviour or an offence, where the victim is not necessarily in the best place to be thinking about an active engagement with the offender. Ironically, that's where a lot of our youth restorative work was initially presented early on in a piece of work, and very often it's actually not the most appropriate place to do that work. So I would begin with an engagement with the victim to find out where is the victim in terms of their sense of management of the trauma that's resulted from the sexual harm or other traumas that are associated around that. How supported are they? What questions do they have? Because that's obviously a significant factor, because they're most likely to have those questions addressed properly, either directly or indirectly through a restorative approach rather than through any other approach. And what are their interests and needs? And therefore you're starting from a process which puts the victim's interests and needs primary. That's not to diminish or set aside the interests and needs of the person who's harmed, but it's to say, well, that's the starting point, really. A lot of people in England and Wales were not doing, for instance, victim contact around victims of harmful sexual behaviour, which is a shocking thing, a shocking state of affairs. Why were they so worried about doing it? Because we don't want to make it worse. Well, where in the victim code of conduct does it say victims have these entitlements, bracket, but not victims of sexual harm, end bracket? You know, victims of sexual harm have a complete entitlement to the range of support, if not more entitlement in many ways, to the support and contact that they should be offered. So it's not about, I don't want to make it worse. It's about, what can I do to avoid making it worse? And not contacting is not the answer. Making contact appropriately and sensitively and being trained to do that is the answer. I know from working in Greater Manchester, I did a survey of victim contact many years back, and they were routinely not contacting victims of sexual offences because they were worried about turning that stone over what they would find.
Yeah, great, thank you. Question similar leading on from that. Can you share what the outcomes have been as a result of using restorative practice in these cases? Any examples that stand out? Maybe any examples that cause pause or reconsideration of the process that resulted in your policy or procedure being amended or reconsidered? I'm sure you must have.
I'm going to start.
I guess it's thinking about what you can share, but is there anything you can share?
Okay, Joy, I'd love to stand here and trot out 20 great outcomes, but I'm going to begin with something that didn't go well, because you often learn. I did a seminar once for a conference about a nightmare on Restoration Street, where we all talked about the stuff that went terrible, because you learn very often from the stuff that doesn't go well. Yeah. We were starting to work with a case where a young man has sexually harmed a cousin, and he was 15. Not all offenders are 15, incidentally, but it's the peak age of offending. And the cousin, I think, was about 6 or 7. And the initial sort of contact with the victim and the victim's family was that they were interested in and wanting to address the harm that occurred, but also they wanted to consider the impact on the family dynamics and what had happened as a consequence of that. which is always a positive reason. And then on the first visits to the young person who'd harmed and his family, we had a sense that there was something that was not being shared with us by the two parents. He had a mother and a father, 15-year-old boy. And in subsequent visits, the parents said, could we just see you alone and talk to you separately without anybody being present there? And that always sort of flags things up. And basically, they told us a story that they had two children, a 15-year-old boy who'd sexually harmed and a 7 or 8-year-old daughter. And they presented as a couple, unified couple, living together under one house as a family. In practice, they had split up many years ago, and father lived another location. He had a job which meant he started very early in the morning, so he got up, did his job, and then came to the house, made the children breakfast, sent them off to school, and then left the family home. But they'd maintained this lie, it's a strong word, but this deception that they were living together for the younger child, the 7-year-old daughter. So the two children in the family, the 15-year-old boy knew that his parents didn't live together, but was expected to keep this secret from his 7-year-old daughter. Now that sounds bizarre. It sounds utterly odd. I remember to this day my jaw hitting the floor when I heard this. I didn't even know what to say, let alone what question to ask. But it presented for us a massive dilemma, because when we were looking at engagement with families, the whole principle around family engagement is around addressing issues around secrecy and not maintaining secrets, because quite often abuse and sexual harm obviously thrives in that cloak of secrecy or secrets being held by family members. So they were asking us to collude with them to maintain this family secret, and we felt incredibly uncomfortable around the doing of that. So in the end, we just decided we needed to share that with the parents and to say why we felt so uncomfortable, and that this is a process based upon openness and honesty and transparency. That's impossible to maintain that when we're also colluding. This is where neutrality and independence gets sort of pulled apart with a massive family secret, which self-evidently was incredibly detrimental to the younger daughter, and also for the 15-year-old boy to have to maintain the secret on behalf of his parents. And we asked them just to reflect on what we said as to whether or not this was a process which would work for them. And then the next meeting, they said, no, this isn't a process that will work for us. Now, we found that about 1/3 of our cases went through to face-to-face meetings. The most common reason for cases not going forward was either the victim or the offender or the family chose not to go forward. And so one of the things I guess we learned from that was that we needed to adhere to our principles, not just because they're fine principles, but because they should inform our practice. And if my experience has been, if we veer away from the principles, we get ourselves into all sorts of complicated and compromised positions. And that usually leads to either a very distorted or damaged or no restorative practice whatsoever. So that was something that we learned very early on, which was about establishing principles of honesty and transparency. In terms of things that have gone very well, the thing that I think is, I mean, I don't want to give you percentages because we haven't got, 63.4% of young people didn't go on to sexually harm. We never measured that. I'm not interested in that, but we did well, I am interested in that, but I wasn't prepared to pay a lot of money for an academic evaluation to answer that question. We wanted to know what were the experiences of the families. So we did experiential narrative evaluations. And what was interesting was the number one thing that all the families valued above anything else was the opportunity for dialogue. Nobody previously had sat down with that family and facilitated a safe and appropriate conversation about the sexual harm that had occurred within the sphere of that family. People who worked with the victim, people who worked with the offender, but nobody had worked with the family as an entity. And that, for me, was an incredibly powerful message about family-based work. And I'd like to think reaffirmed our choice of family group conferencing as the appropriate model.
Yeah. we're running out of time, but two final questions. One hopefully short question, one that might be a little bit more complicated. The first one is the question: is the restorative conferencing or family group conferencing the same as community conferencing in this context? Is that something that you have knowledge about?
I do, and I'd say no, not really. Family group conferencing is a very specific model with private family planning time that looks to rebalance the power relationships between professionals and families. I know that some forms of community conferencing have cohort groups or cabals or little groups that separate off, but family group conferencing in its original model as described by New Zealand, and I'm not sure what the current model is as described by New Zealand practice, but very specifically has this at its heart, private family planning time, and the family being given a responsibility, but also an expectation to be significant partners in providing the solutions. So I would say no, it's different than community conferencing.
That's helpful. One final question. How do you deal with shame? We talked a lot about shame, but how do you deal with shame?
Well, the first thing I think we do is we acknowledge it, and maybe we need to find other words for it. And again, if you take a narrative-based approach, people will tell you stories. The case study that we use, the mum there couldn't even begin to use the word shame. She talked about blame. But when we explored what she meant by blame, she was clearly talking about the shame that was associated with one member of her family sexually harming another member of her family. So I think the first thing is acknowledgement. And often we have this in our sort of contemporary Judeo-Christian beliefs that shame is a toxic thing. But I take Braithwaite's approach that we allow it to become toxic, but actually it's a mark of our humanity. And it's a fantastically powerful motivator for people as well, if they feel ashamed, to be able to express that to a group or to an individual who will not condemn them or marginalize or stigmatize them, but will attempt to reintegrate and allow re-inclusion. And that's where the restorative work for us started. So the starting point is acknowledgement, but then it's about reintegration and shame being expressed to the community that needs it most. I mean, most young people who are sexually harmed will feel incredibly ashamed when they appear in court, but actually they don't give a shit about that court, to be blunt about it, and the magistrates or the judges, it's peripheral to their lives. What matter to them are their families and their communities. They're the people who they fear the judgment of.
Well, thank you so much. Well, we should probably wrap up there. I know a lot of people are having to leave, and so I don't want to keep other people
right.
if they're feeling polite.
Sign on for the training.
Yeah, I will circulate the flyer about the training and with the details so people will have the link in an email, probably tomorrow. If not tomorrow, definitely next week, depending on if I'm able to get it done. And tomorrow, the link's also there in the chat. Also, if everyone who's attended is happy, and so I'm just getting another link, to fill out an evaluation form, that'd be really great, and that will really help us. And obviously send me an email as well if you'd like to stay on our mailing list if you're not already on it. I know many of you already are on that list from attending previous events, but if you're not and you'd like to receive emails from us in the future, then please let me know. And we hope to see you again soon. Any final words from you, Vince?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, Joy. Thank you very much to all your colleagues. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a room together where we can talk and interact. But this is the next best thing, so it's enabled us to connect far and wide. So that's a fantastic opportunity. So thank you very much. I'm going to get myself another cup of tea.
Sounds great. Thank you for coming.
Cheers. Bye. Bye.